Okay, it's that time again. I think it's the third time I've done a wrap-up best of. I usually do best of fiction and best of non-fiction, but I'm going to do best of both here. And It's been an interesting year. I've elsewhere talked about my best of small press fiction, so I'm not necessarily going to repeat myself, although I am at sometimes. Has it been a good year? Maybe not quite as good. There's been some exceptional books, I think, and I've read one or two, I think, I feel sort of slightly life changing. But in terms of the volume, the quantity and quality, I think a couple of it hasn't been the best year. But I might change my mind when I review what I've read. Okay, so let's just cut it. In no particular order. Atrib by Ellie Williams. This is a book of short stories, although I'm slightly loath to call them short stories because I think that sort of rather makes them seem more ordinary or familiar than they are, and what they are is not ordinary familiar. She's an extraordinarily gifted, brilliant, odd writer of short fictions, very short fictions, 5-10 pages or whatever, and they often possess a sort of central idea which you could kind of I don't know, call kind of conceptual, to which she then applies her literary mind, and what you have therefore is they feel more like small little literary artworks than stories themselves. One of the stories is one of the best stories I've ever read. It's just an extraordinary feat of sort of literary fireworks. It's called where is it? No, that's very interesting. It's actually not in the list of stories. I'm just going to quickly flick through it. It's called or maybe, let's see, 1 second. Sorry, this is really boring for you. Right, yes it is. It's just got a subtitle. It's called Smote, but it's subtitled Or When I Find I Cannot Kiss You in Front of a Print by Bridget Riley. It is just a remarkable piece of writing, and anyone who's interested in the short fiction form should read this. It's getting a lot of noise, so it's probably already on your radar, but it's an extraordinary piece of work. I have to go back right to the beginning of the year for Francis Buffer's Golden Hill. I think I reviewed this on BookTube in January. So it was published the year before, but this is the year I got to it. I think it's at the time, it's a sort of 18th century romp. We get written not as a pastiche, but it has a kind of an homage. It has all the tonality and all the sort of what's the word? Sort of kind of I don't know, can't think. I think I said, at the time, it's very florid and sort of almost slightly chaotic, but in the hands of Francis Buffett, who is one of the finest prose writers around at the moment, it just becomes a real joy. It's a sort of mystery story set in early 18th century New York, and it's just an extraordinary kind of romp through set piece after set piece. But really, we know that there is a deep heart to this book, and that something profound is going on. But he doesn't demand that we think this. It's just we have a feeling that something important is going to happen, and it really does. But I think in the end, I saw Francis Buffett on a panel, and I said to him, you know, when you were writing this, did you have a sense that sometimes you were writing, some of the most extraordinary prose? And he was too gracious to say yes, but he said, I know when I'm really immersed in something, and I was really immersed in this, which is his way of saying, I think, yes, he does realise that he hit heights that perhaps he hasn't hit before, and most of us will never hit. But it's a brilliant piece of novel writing, and to talk about a brilliant piece of novel writing, which is completely different in form. And obviously won the Booker Prize, is George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo. And what can I say of this apart from it perplexed me, it baffled me, it confused me, it enchanted me, it entranced me, and it made me cry. And it made me realise that there are almost no bounds to what the novel is. And that if you are looking to tell a story, there is no reason why you need to go with your first way to tell your story, your second way to tell your story, your third way to tell your story. And in fact, if you keep going, you might end up telling it from the kind of angle, the kind of slant that George Saunders does in Lincoln in the Bardo. And the very fact that he pulls it off is a small miracle in itself. And it's just, it is a novel to which we kind of owe a debt of thanks because two things: to be formally inventive and have this level emotional punch is really, really difficult. I'm just going to turn my light on. Lamp on. Yeah. Okay. Towards the beginning of the year, once again, The Faith of the Faithless, Simon Critchley. This is essentially a philosopher. He's the Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School of University. It's an attempt, and a brilliant attempt, and a successful attempt to look at how we might think about faith and religion as in our secular society, and what it might teach us in terms of how we approach society and how we value it, and that secularism does not necessarily give us ways to live, or the kind of optics, or the full set of optics in terms of how society might be viewed, and how life might be viewed, and how our relationships might be viewed. And Critchley does it, and it is difficult at times. His reading is deep and broad, but it's just a extraordinary piece of thinking, rendered with great confidence and intellectual scope, and I highly recommend it. A very short novel, Blue Self-Portrait by Naomi Lefebvre, and translated, and it's brilliantly translated, by Sophie Lewis. This is published by Les Fugitives in the UK. I imagine it's published in the US. And I think I've said of this, it's on the surface, it's about a woman sitting with her sister on a plane from Berlin to France, and she's recounting her a meeting with a pianist who in Berlin, who's trying to write a piece of music about Schoenberg, the 12-tone composer's portrait of himself in blue. So a pianist is trying to write a piece of music about a musician composer who has painted a portrait. That is kind of it, but it is so much more. And one of the most moving passages, moving themes through it, is this just incidental musing on cattle losing their calves. It's very odd, but it's extraordinary. I've talked about it elsewhere. For anyone, once again, quite formally what's brilliant about this is that Lefebvre and the translator have captured voice so well. It's in the first person, and it's kind of charming, funny, playful, clever, mischievous, and that's so hard to do in the first person without being kind of either arch or pretentious. And it's even, when she's on this plane, she's reading the letters between Theodore Adorno and Thomas Mann, which is quite a pretentious thing for a person to be reading while she's talking about Schoenberg and composition and painting and etc. But it's utterly believable and compelling, and you want to spend time with her. Very good. Compass, which I've talked about before, Matthias N.R., Fitzcarraldo editions, brilliantly, N.R. has once again been brilliantly translated by Charlotte Mandel. This didn't win the International Man Booker Prize, and it should. It's essentially a novel which happens over one night. A man has a sleepless night in Vienna, and he's thinking about a lost love, and his relationship with this woman, both as a lover and not as a lover, is happened in the Middle East. But over that one sleepless night, it really is a kind of evocation of the West's relationship with the Middle East, in terms of the academic enterprise of Orientalism, if you want to call it, in the 19th century, and how all those people who went to the East and brought the East back to us in the West, the Middle East, defined how we saw the Middle East. And it's because it's set in this sleepless night, it feels like a kind of waking dream state as he moves around the Middle East with this woman, and so it's a brilliant, can I say, concatenation of form, content, and subject matter. I've said before, it's got something of the kind of dream quality of 1001 Nights, but it all happens in one night. It's written in very long, sort of disconnected sentences where you're not quite sure where you are, it has a kind of mirage sense to it, and at the same time, it has no kind of stability. So it means that it very much is about kind of how we grapple with illusion, and we try and pin down what we can't, which is the sort of the heat and the otherness of a culture that we don't know. It's really good. Omen Setter's Luck by William H. Gass. William H. Gass died a week ago. He's an extraordinary novelist, and this is an extraordinary book. His first book, the final draft of this book was stolen when he was a college professor by another professor, and he had to rewrite the whole thing, and it's apparently very different. He's a very tough, ornery, difficult writer who was ploughing his own furrow, didn't care how difficult his fiction was, didn't care what anybody think of this. Now, actually, had he started, if you read the first 20 or 30 pages of this, it feels like a sort of brilliant 20th century American novel, kind of in the Faulkner tradition. But the moment he gets to the second central section, which is called The Reverend Jethro Ferber's Change of Heart, which is most of the novel, and which William H. Gass says, without that, the novel is nothing. It's a really tough bit of prose. We're in the mind of a difficult, mean-spirited, sort of almost demonically vile man, and it's once again like other formerly difficult novels. It's a kind of stream of consciousness, but it doesn't give us anything in terms of sort of rhythms and sense. It essentially tries to break that up, so we get we get this complete. I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of like it's like all of his brain has been sort of churned up and poisoned, and we're just in it, in all its poison and its churn. And so it's a really extraordinary piece of writing. I realise I'm going on quite a bit. I'm just quickly going to go to Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, which actually beat on Golden Hill to the Costa Prize, and it shouldn't. Golden Hill is a better novel. This is sold enormously well, but I've just finished it. And even though I think it fails as a novel because it's too kindly and in the end a bit sentimental, what it does do, once again, it's a first-person narrative, but it's a first-person narrative where there's no way the person writing it, if you will, could have the prose style and the kind of imagistic facility that this narrator does, except it's so beautifully written. The metaphors, the images, the similes, all of these things are rendered so wonderfully that it's just an absolute joy to read. Sebastian Barry is a beautiful, beautiful maker of sentences. It's a shame he can't, in this book, put this in a kind of, a kind of realist setting, because it should be dark given what happened, but he won't let go of his characters. But if anyone's thinking of writing something where you're using a voice that can't be as literary as you want to, then what you do is you have to mine the idioms of the time and see whether from that mining you can come up with a voice and then that earns its ability to talk and write in the way it does. And that's a good example. Penultimate, Robinson by Jack Robinson, aka Charles Boyle. This is a short piece. I just realised, I just found out the other day that it was William H. Gass who coined the phrase metafiction. This is a piece of beautiful metafiction about the Robinson Crusoe character, and it's witty, it's playful, it's erudite, it's got some beautiful sentence making. I've said this before, I've talked about this a lot. I really love this book. But really it's just this musing on life through the lens of Robinson Crusoe, as a man who's representative of something of the English sensibility, on an island and just making do and getting on, and through that Jack Robinson, aka Charles Boyle, tells his own story, the story of other people who have looked at Robinson Crusoe as a metaphor. It doesn't sound as though it's going to be as interesting as it is, but it's just entrancing. Now, finally, I think probably my book of the year is Team of Rivals: The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln by Doris Kearns Goodwin. This is an extraordinary act of scholarship, but it's an extraordinary act of writing. She is the most gifted writer. She is playing with so many different complex personalities, and each one is rendered so uniquely with so much life that as she puts everyone in a room, puts everyone under pressure in order to tell the story with real verve and energy, it feels utterly real, and as though one knows how and why these people are acting the way they are. Within 20 pages, she's unpicked, put back together, and provided us with 4 of the most important, or 5 of the most important people in the Lincoln administration. And then when she goes back and talks about his past, it feels utterly real. And so I think as an act of biography, I don't think I've ever read anything as good, or as able, or as penetrating, but at the same time making it the most kind of joyful reading experience, because you are immersed in a world of people, not of characters and not of historical personages, but people with their psychological flaws and their psychological whims and their vanity and their brilliance, and it's just first class and unrivaled. So Team of Rivals. This is this book has, to my mind, has no rival as a work of biography. That's it. Thank you. Bye bye.